Let's shift to Israel for a little bit. That has something to do with the Jews, right? There's something in there. So I know you can make many arguments, and I'd be happy for you to lay them out, religious arguments for the reasons that Israel should exist as a state. I think you can make many secular arguments that make as much sense, historical sense, that have nothing to do with God giving this group of people this piece of land. All right, well, let's start there then, because I thought you were going to go more on the religious side. So let's talk about
historically. I just think historically, here's a people that, that inhabited that land, that had that land, that always wished to return to that land, that was forcibly exiled from that land and returned to it. So there's my historical
You wrap that up pretty neatly.
I wrap that, exactly.
All right, so when people say, well, wait a minute, the Palestinians lived there. Now, I know we can sort of...
Do we want to do this?
Well, we can do this for the next 5 hours, but let's just do a couple minutes of the historical stuff before...
Here's a couple minutes. One of the things that people don't realize is there never was an independent state ever in that area after Israel was destroyed thousands of years ago. There wasn't a Palestine. It was always part of a bigger empire. It was never a separate country until 1948 when it became Israel again.
Meaning it was part of the Ottoman Empire.
It was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was part of the Roman Empire. It was always part of someone's empire. It was never a separate state. If you come to a place, and also there is the reality that throughout history, when people have come to a place and they've built it up and they've made it their own, it's become their own. Now, a lot of origins of states are lost to prehistory. We don't know how France became France. I assure you, if we did, it would involve war and conquest, as the beginning of every state inevitably does. The question now is less the origin of it than the disposition of it. That is, how is it that you accommodate the different people who live in that land in a way that makes it possible to have peace? I don't think that it is too much in a world that has 48 Muslim states to have a Jewish one. And I don't think that most of the world thinks that it's too much.
So when the UN focuses so much on Israel, and so much of the media is constantly attacking Israel, and so much of what I see from the modern left, not really from the right anymore, maybe you
well, it depends the right where. It depends where. Go to Europe.
At least through an American lens.
Right, through an American lens, yes. Yes.
This endless focus on Israel, this place that's the size of New Jersey, that has one airport, that at one point without the West Bank is about 6 miles wide or something. I mean, it's absurdly tiny. What is that focus? Is that just that chosen people thing again? Like
so I think that it's a lot of different things. Is there an element of anti-Semitism? Unquestionably. I mean, anybody who denies that is being ridiculous. Of course there is. It's also the fact that, don't forget that Jews are still the origin of Christianity is Judaism. And Christians and Jews had this sibling rivalry that got enshrined, unfortunately, in the New Testament, because the family quarrels are sometimes the most bitter. So that always, the existence of Jews in Israel always has a special meaning. Today, a much better one, but for a long time, a very negative one to Christians. And that venom continued on even in people who left Christianity, unfortunately. And then in the Muslim world, the confluence of a political and a clearly anti-Semitic ideology made it basically so that Israel had almost nowhere to turn. And the UN is just a moral swamp. It's just a moral swamp. I mean, when North Korea, when Libya is on the Human Rights Council, and
Saudi Arabia is running women's rights.
Exactly, it's just a moral swamp. It's such look, I've done some work with the UN, and I just want to say, for the record, there are things in the UN that do really wonderful work around the world. But as an institution, you want to throw your hands up and say, really, this is the best that humanity can come up with.
Well, it's certainly not the best humanity can come up with, but yet here we are.
Here we are.
That focus, though, that sort of focus, and it's interesting, you said there has to be a piece of anti-Semitism related to this sort of relentless onslaught. I always find there's an interesting situation with the Christians that I think you sort of alluded to. Maybe it used to be that rivalry, but now if you look at evangelical support for Israel and Christian support in general, I bet you that statistically it's probably higher than Jewish support for Israel, which is insane.
No, I've had that experience that I've gone on trips to Israel at times when there's been like an intifada or whatever. The only other groups that are there are Christian groups. Jewish groups aren't there. And you say to yourself, this is an extraordinary, really an extraordinary phenomenon. And the amount of genuine goodwill in the, let's just talk about America now, in the American Christian community, the right American Christian community, I'm talking about the right wing now, just because that's where the evangelicals almost all are, not all, but almost all are, is extraordinary. It's really extraordinary. Look, I mean, I've had this experience. This experience is enshrined in one of my books. One of my books called Why Faith Matters, the preface was written by Rick Warren. Now, the idea that an evangelical minister would write a preface to a rabbi's book about faith, it's just, that's a different world. Let me tell you a beautiful story. I had a professor, wonderful man named Eliezer Slomovic, and he came from Eastern Europe, and he learned when you go by a church, you spit. That was what he was taught as a child, because they all want to kill you. That's what he learned. All of his family went through camps. He escaped, but he went to a labor camp. A lot of his family died in the Holocaust. He comes to the United States. He starts teaching at the University of Judaism, now called the American Jewish University. There's an Interfaith conference in Berkeley, and the president of the university tells him, Eliezer, I want you to go. And he says, I'm not going. There's no way I'm going to an Interfaith conference. There's no way I'm going to sit there with Christians. But he's an immigrant. He's new. And the president says, you got to go. So he goes. The opening meal, the minister who's leading the meal says, I would like to begin this meal the way our Lord Jesus Christ would have begun the meal. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz, which is the Hebrew blessing over bread. And Eliezer said he started to cry. He didn't know that the world could be as different as it was when he was growing up. And that's what it is, to live now and to live in America.
In an odd twist, did they serve all shellfish? Because that would have been,
you can use that. I don't know. I don't know, but good of you to ask.
All right, so the interfaith thing you mentioned, is that an odd place for a rabbi to be, because there's nothing about converting other people in Judaism, right? You're not looking to convert.
Yes and no. No, you're not looking, I mean, there is something about, before Constantine and before it was made a capital crime, Jews did convert people who were monotheists, but who were non-monotheists. So an interfaith thing that was not really a conversion, it's an opportunity for people to talk about their beliefs. And you can certainly learn from other religious traditions. I don't believe, and I don't think that anyone should believe, that Judaism has a monopoly on truth. I've learned a lot from Christian ministers. I've learned a lot from dialogue with Muslims. So I think that that's a good thing. With Hindu, I've had gurus at the synagogue. I've had the Dalai Lama at the synagogue. I think that's a good thing.
Right. So I'm not saying you specifically, but just generally the idea that Jews aren't looking to proselytize.
No, not
so that it's a little different. So that if you do an interfaith thing and you got a third Jews and a third Christians and a third Muslims, well, the Christians and the Muslims would love to have those Jews convert, right?
Right.
I mean, that is a...
They certainly, well...
That is a fundamental difference.
It is a fundamental difference. Not all Christians, not all Muslims feel that way, but yeah. Jews basically feel, it's stated several times in the Talmud, that whatever the world to come is, the righteous of all nations have a place in the world to come. So I don't need to save your soul, because if you're a good enough person, you're saved, because Judaism believes that it's how you act in this world that makes the difference. It's not whether you believe X, Y, or Z. So yeah, we don't have the same motivation. We have a motivation towards goodness more than we do a motivation towards a specific belief.
So let's talk about the afterlife a little bit.
Okay, I'm all in favor of it. I am a big fan of the afterlife. Big fan of the afterlife.
I can tell you do watch Curb Your Enthusiasm. That had a little Larry to it. But there's no heaven and hell, right? In Judaism?
Well, not exactly. There is. Judaism tends not to define exactly what happens to you after you die. And that makes sense, because as soon as you start to define it, it starts to sound ridiculous. Mark Twain has a passage in Letters from Earth where he says, people think they're going to lie on green fields and listen to harp music. Right. He says they wouldn't want to do it for 5 minutes while they're alive. They think they'll be happy for the rest of eternity doing it after they die.
Right.
What I would say that Judaism says is that there's something about the human being that is eternal. And just as you could not have anticipated this world before you came into it, you never would have imagined like bricks and eyes and tuna fish and ideas and words. I mean, who would have imagined? You can't possibly imagine what another world is like, but there is one.
So does that change the ability for, or not the ability, I guess the actions that you take as a rabbi? Like everything in Judaism that I know is sort of about life. It's like, it's here, it's now,
right.
It's this kind of thing.
Well,
you're not waiting
that's why I think it's so amorphous, is that the emphasis has to be on here, because you don't want to act here like as put in the Talmud, like a servant for a reward. You're not doing this so you get that. If you do, then religious life has no meaning. The whole point is to do it because you think it's worth doing, right? That's what goodness is. Goodness isn't being good so that you get a reward. Goodness is being good because you believe in goodness.
Right. Hopefully just for
its own sake.
Actual right reason.
Right.
So when you conceptualize God, I mean, is it a conscious being? I mean, is God watching this right now? Does God have YouTube? I mean, what are we talking about here?
I think God doesn't need YouTube, but I don't mean to dampen your no doubt gigantic audience. But so the way I put it to the high school kids is, I say, look, to a 14-year-old, I say, imagine when a 2-year-old. Can a 2-year-old imagine what a 14-year-old is like? No. Not only can you not, a 2-year-old can't imagine it, they can't even imagine what it is that they're not able to grasp. We are, in Jewish reckoning, the distance between us and God is infinitely greater than the distance between a 2-year-old and a 14-year-old. So I don't begin to know what God's like. And I wouldn't begin to say, yeah, God's listening to us, which is a very anthropomorphic conception of God. All I do believe is that you can live your life in a way that is in conformity with the way you were intended to live, or less so. That's what I know. So there are moments, so I think in some ways I put a greater emphasis on godliness than I do on God. That is the way that I believe God wants us, wants in quotes, because again, wants is a human thing, wants us to act without worrying too much about what God is like, because I know that I'm incapable of beginning to understand that.
Could you do all that without God?
You could. The question that I always wonder is, does that stick? Not for a life. I mean, there could be atheists who are kinder than any religious believer. Right. I know a lot of good atheists. I'm sure you do too.
Yeah.
The question is, as a society, does that get transmitted generation to generation if you don't believe that there's an ultimate standard that transcends us? And I'm deeply skeptical that that would happen.